dastardly crime are you up to now, Dick Dastardly?
A foolproof way to win this wacky race, that's what.
And now, here they are, the most daredevil group of daffy drivers to ever whirl their wheels in the wacky races, competing for the title of the world's wackiest racer. As the wacky racers roar across the desert, dashing toward Hand Springs, Wyoming, the drivers are desperately trying to pass one another.
Pretty much all the Saturday morning stuff was superhero and action-adventure shows. And there was a lot of parents groups, I guess, that figured there was too much violence on television. So in the year that Wacky Races came out, they kind of went back to basics like slapstick comedy, more Roadrunner, Tom and Jerry type gags.
Drat and double drat!
The Hanna-Barbera stuff, when I was a kid, it was like the most polished out of all the productions that were being done at that time. I mean, the music was above par, the sound effects, the voice acting, it all kind of just came together as one solid package.
Saturday morning TV at that time for this studio, Hanna-Barbera Studios, was like the mother bird that was trying to feed that nest of newly hatched little birds, because TV was like just having all of these gaping mouths that you had to keep dropping shows into.
Just the amount of work that went through there at that time, too, was just it was amazing that they got anything done, just with the schedules and how many episodes that they had to crank out. It's just amazing that they kept that level of quality up. It was like above and beyond anything that was being done at the time.
I've always looked at that as sort of an age of discovery in animation, where challenges were thrown at animators to come up with things that have never been thought of or tried before. The first thing that I remember hearing about was the fact that we were to create all of these characters with their cars. Then each week, they would be involved in a race.
It was going to be more of a game where you had to send in who you thought was going to win the race every week or something like that.
And then there would be prizes given away for kids that would pick the winner. It was more of a game show than anything else. And of course, I think the powers that be stepped in and said, you can't do that. So anyway, it just became the show that it eventually evolved into.
You know, they did 17 half hours, and each half hour had 2 different cartoons. So, you know, that's what, 34 different races, and you have people like Iwo and Jerry designing this stuff. You're not going to get anything bad anyway. They probably had 100 cars to choose from.
You had so many hands in this show. I mean, you get all those people in a room, and it's going to be pop culture of whatever was popular at that time.
With Wacky Races, I think there were a lot of things in movies that were sort of like that. So you had Frankenstein-like monsters racing alongside classic 1920s gangsters.
It's almost like they weren't trendsetters. They just kind of went along with what was going on. If it was a popular TV show, or if there was an aspect of the TV show that was popular at the time, they would take that and expand on it and just kind of give it a little bit more of a twist rather than just do it verbatim.
Hanna-Barbera always seemed to understand the importance of having distinctive vehicles. The Flintstones car, the Jetsons car. If you saw those without seeing any other characters or even a background, you'd know what show it was from because they were so unique.
The great thing about the Hanna-Barbera cartoons and the period of time that these shows were produced is that they utilized actors who originally came from radio. And there's a big difference between a radio voice actor and an actor doing a voice.
Boy, did I have a good time. Only girl on that show. And all these wonderful actors. There were about 6 actors and 11 cars and about 15 or 20 voices.
They were doubling, tripling, quadrupling. They were doing many, many voices. And you'll see often an actor talking to himself.
I've seen film clips of Dawes Butler behind a microphone, and he'd do one voice and the other.
You know, you had somebody like Don Mezek or Janet Waldo or Paul Winchell or any of those people that could do multiple voices, and it didn't sound like one person doing the same voice.
The actors were all very, very concerned because they all had a lot of voices to do, and they would do their homework. In other words, when we'd start the session, they would get off in a corner or even at the table, and they would practice their different voices like an orchestra tuning up.
They could do anything. I mean, they were just marvelous. And they not only would answer to the traditional feeling of a character, but they would be so inventive. They were as creative with an off-the-top-of-the-head approach to a character as we might be in terms of how you design the character.
We pulled out all the stops. We figured that it didn't matter because we weren't being photographed, so we just would go crazy.
To me, just in general, the Hanna-Barbera stable of voice actors was as important as the animation because they had to make the scripts work and creatively fill in if something wasn't animating a lot. They had the best voice talent of anybody, I think.
You're working with limited animation here. You can't do full-out facial expressions like you can in a feature film. You don't have the time, you don't have the money or the budget, so you rely a lot on the voice to bring across, acting-wise, whatever you can't do character-wise in the animation.
The Wacky Racers are off to a good start, folks. All except Dick Dastardly, who seems to be tied up at the moment.
Drat!
Hanna-Barbera probably started using the narrator in Wacky Races because of the nature of the show itself. Because it was a race, and races generally have someone calling the race. And also, again, I think it probably had to do with the number of voice actors that they were using. It freed them from the characters having to give a lot of exposition that the narrator could do in a humorous way.
You always felt that the narrator was actually there watching the race or officiating the race, because every once in a while Dastardly would break that fourth wall and look right at the camera and start talking to the narrator.
Better watch out, Dick.
Why?
You're approaching the end of the bridge.
Huh? Yikes!
They were very smart to use a narrator in the show because, again, you're working with a limited budget and a limited time. In animation, what the narrator did for this particular show is it moved the pace of the cartoon along.
And away they go on the way out Wacky Races.
Wacky Races title sequence was a really neat graphic take on it. Introduced all the cars. It's like 30 seconds. They show the entire show right there. You heard that theme music, you heard the thing, you know, you come running out of the kitchen with your bowl of cereal and you're there.
Jerry Eisenberg had just a natural feeling for what this show required.
Most of it just came out of my imagination as far as for the looks of the cars. You remember things that you've seen in the past, whether it's in a cartoon or a live-action movie. We always had books to look at for reference, you know, maybe a little something would trigger a thought.
One of the things that makes the show interesting is the fact that these cars had a great deal of diverse looks and names.
Joe Barbera would come down to our room and pick the ones he liked. Sometimes he'd make a blend, you know. He'd say, take a part of this one that someone did and part of this one that maybe someone else did and put it together. Originally, I designed a boulder mobile, like a car that looked like a big boulder with this one caveman sitting in it. And Joe liked it. But then he came back the next day, probably talked with his writers, maybe the network people. And he said, well, we'd like to have 2 cavemen in it. Let's make them the Slag Brothers.
Slag Brothers I loved because they were almost completely inarticulate and they just sit there whomping each other. You know, how great is it to ride around in a rock and just beat your brother on the head with a club, you know, and go, ugga, ugga.
They just like smack the other cars with their clubs, and when something wasn't working right, the car would break and pebble.
The creepy coop is losing traction on the ice, and Little Gruesome shifts to dragon power for a little flame action. It worked!
What I liked about the Creepy Coupe monster car is that they would shift into various gears on the dashboard there, and you might have dragon power.
I love the Gruesome Twosome. They were great. They had that big old dragon in the belfry, and whenever they needed to get ahead of somebody, the dragon would just sprout wings and off they'd fly.
This is one that Jerry and I sort of threw back and forth, kept adding ideas, you know, such as bats flying out of the belfry, you know, that sort of thing.
The gags like that, whether they were written or whether they were just put in the storyboard stage, I mean, the gags like that just made me howl in front of the TV.
Driver Pat Pending is always inventing. How about that bit? He's changed into a giant drill.
Professor Pat Pending in the converter car, he would shift into certain gears on his dashboard. It's the converter car is exactly what it is, a car would convert itself into anything at the time that Professor Pat Pending needed. I've seen it turned into a vacuum cleaner. I've seen it turned into a hot air balloon. Whatever he needs to get away from Dastardly and try and win a race.
Pat Pending's car, you could never figure out it could do anything. You know, he could just push a button and it change into a pogo stick.
He lacked the maliciousness of Dastardly, but he certainly had equal inventiveness when it came to using that to get an edge on somebody.
And now it's number 4, the Red Max, making his move.
That's not a car, that's a plane, you know. It may skim above the ground, but the guy was pretty close to just making an air race out of it.
It's an airplane. And it would jump over the other cars.
I love that car because it could take off and pass everybody.
Uh-oh, Penelope's having a little engine trouble.
Oh dear, now what could the matter be?
Penelope Pit Stop, I loved. One of my first crushes.
Oh, I love that. Isn't that nice?
I mean, she's so cute in that southern accent.
Thank you, Colonel.
Ooh-wee! You all can invade my plantation anytime.
I remember Joe coming into my office and saying, I'm in the middle of a meeting. We're going over the wacky races, and we came to a realization that there were no females in the show at all. And he said it would help if we got at least one in there. And he said, just put together a car and a girl. She was designed in about 2 hours, I think.
For Penelope Pit Stop, they just called me to a session for the wacky races and said, you're Penelope Pit Stop. Well, Southern gal, you know, she's driving this car, the compact Pussycat. She drove it and she had her own little beauty supply there, you know, and she could put on lipstick while she's driving and she could fix her hair and she'd say, oh dear, you know, something's falling apart here.
I thought it was funny that she could push a button and a huge hair dryer would come out of the trunk, comes down over the car, you know, it dries her off, spoofs her up, and yet the 20 minutes it took her to do that, it doesn't matter, she still won the race.
Speed limit, 85 miles an hour. Quit dragging your feet, meekly. Charge!
The Army Surplus Special, you've got a tough sergeant and a meek private. So what do you call them? Private Meekly. You know, Sergeant Blast, because he's got a loud, obnoxious voice. And you put them in an Army tank, you throw number 6 on it, and it's a race car.
Servicemen gags were always funny. I like to see Sarge, you know, yelling his head off.
Ouch! Out of the way, meekly!
Army Surplus Special I liked a lot. It would like just shoot randomly, you know, like the cannon would shoot and they'd get out of control and they'd be spinning around, stuff like that.
Uh-oh, looks like too much hill for the anthill mob.
All right, you guys, everybody out and push.
The Anthill Mob number 7 in their bulletproof bomb, I mean, they were obviously a 1940s Untouchables era car. Gangsters are in the car and they're trying to win a race.
I always liked when their feet came out the bottom and they, you know, I'm sure everybody liked that part, but I thought that was kind of neat. And the fact that they were just always bunched up together and they always ran in a bunch.
Wow! Listen to that motor hum. That's quite a powerful motor you've got there, Luke.
Yep, and it costs only peanuts to run.
The Arkansas Chug-a-Bug, that was pretty cool because you know, the guy driving at the wheel was always asleep and the bear was always freaking out.
Let go of me, you gosh dang blubbering bear!
Love those guys. Love the fact that Blubber was always crying about something and Luke would just sit there and go, like, speed her up, Blubber.
Taking an early lead is that Beau Brummel of the Brake Van Burners, Peter Perfect, in number 9, the Turbo Terrific.
Peter Perfect, you know, his car was always falling apart. Didn't matter what it was, you know. He'd just stop it and it would fall, the wheels would fall off.
He was always trying to rescue Penelope, which was very nice of him.
Having automotive trouble, Pretty Penny?
I'm giving my little old wheels a quick drip-dry wash, because they won't run with that dirty old mud on them.
How feminine.
I always kind of sensed that there was something going on between Penelope and Peter Perfect, because he'd call her Miss Penelope, and then she'd say, oh, why, you're just a little old cutie pie, Peter Perfect.
Way to handsprings, Rufus Roughcut in car number 10 hacks his way ahead.
Rufus was, you know, big, burly Paul Bunyan type, kind of a lunkhead, and Sawtooth was, you know, he's kind of the brains of the organization. And I like the fact that he could drive a, you know, car down the road on 2 giant saws and not cut up everything.
My favorite car that I used to draw all the time was Rufus Roughcut and the Buzzwagon. I don't know why, but I just thought that was the coolest thing.
Nothing can stop us now, Mudley. We're a cinch to win this one. One more exhibition like that, and you'll walk the rest of the way.
Gotta love Dastardly and Muttley. They're just classic, and just left to their own, they were amazingly funny. Dastardly was some wild scheme, and Muttley just sitting off to the side.
thing I remember was always trying to find the most sinister way that was funny in terms of what Dastardly and Muttley would do. And it had more to do not so much with the initial idea of what they were doing, but how they would do it.
Dick Dastardly was always just massacred.
You know going in that the Wile E. Coyote is not going to catch and eat the Roadrunner, just as you know Dick Dastardly, for all his machinations, is not going to win the race. Still, it's fun to see him try. It's fun to see him mislead everybody, to set traps, to have the running relationship with Muttley, because sometimes you get the idea like these two are really not fond of each other, but Muttley is with Dastardly because I think Muttley just enjoys to see Dastardly destroy himself time after time and gives Muttley something to laugh at.
Muttley! Do something! Anything!
You know, did I ever want to see Dastardly win the race? Yeah, I did. I really just wanted to see him win once, you know? And that's what kept me tuning in as a kid. It's like, maybe Dastardly will win this time.
Dastardly and Muttley always got busted for cheating because they were cheating trying to stop others from winning, whereas the other cars were going into their various modes to help themselves. Whereas Dastardly and Muttley, that's all they did. They were trying to win the race, but the way they did this, they were going to dig a ravine and make all the cars fall into it, or put up an exit sign or a detour sign. The next thing you know, all the Wacky Races cars are on a merry-go-round in a theme park, you know. They just kept going and minding their own business. They might have won on their own.
With Dastardly and Muttley, Bill and Joe had their first really great recurring villains. They're just a terrific duo.
At the finish line, the crowd is tense with excitement.
Racing is hotter than ever now. NASCAR is becoming huge, and so it only seems natural that there'd be a re-emergence and a re-interest in Wacky Races.
There's always been merchandise for these characters. It would usually come out like about a year after the show would hit, because it would take that long for them to decide if the show was a success or not. But it would usually be like board games, coloring books, comic books, anything in print. Cereal premiums, a lot of that.
There was a resurgence in Muttley popularity a few years ago in Japan, of all places, because I think they began importing the show to Japan, so I think the show had the second life over there, and Muttley became amazingly popular.
I think like with each generation of young kids, you know, I think boys and girls love cars. I think that's part of it, but the characters too, you know. I like to design warm, lovable characters. I feel those are the ones that will endure. You know, there's a lot of interesting characters that are done here and there, but they don't seem to endure for decades.
My kids grew up on my cartoons because they were always watching, and I was probably in the kitchen doing the dishes or baking a cake, and they remember everything about all the cartoons that I did.
The Hanna-Barbera cartoons are timeless. Just because something was produced however many years ago, doesn't matter. They still hold up today. For some reason, I think what they do is they take you back to a simpler time when you were a kid and didn't have a care in the world.
I think that the thing that appealed to me most was just the fact that it was just a slapstick cartoon. It was those old gags where, you know, they drive off a cliff, they're suspended in air for 2 seconds, and they drop off and crash.
The attitude of the shows in themselves, if you search deeply into these shows, there is a very relatable human quality in terms of delivering something that they would hope would be entertaining to the public in general, but in a meaningful way.
The Double O has yet to reach the finish line. What happened, Dick?
I stopped to give someone my autograph.
Oh, you're kidding. Who would want your autograph?
Him!